On April the 10th, 1912, the largest moving object ever built by human hands prepared to embark on her maiden voyage. The RMS Titanic, gleaming white against the Southampton docks, stood as a testament to an age that believed in the impossible. Her 4 towering smokestacks pierced the spring sky, and her hull stretched nearly 900 feet, longer than 3 city blocks. As passengers gathered on the pier that morning, looking up at this floating palace, few could have imagined that within 4 days she would rest forever on the ocean floor 2.5 miles beneath the waves. But before we continue this journey, welcome to Soft History Channel. I'm your host Sam, where we explore the past in calm, soothing detail. Tonight's journey is designed to help you relax, unwind, or drift gently into sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning or night where you are? Are you listening while working, relaxing, or drifting off to sleep? Share in the comments. It's always wonderful to hear from you. Now, back to our journey. Imagine yourself standing in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in the spring of 1909. The air thrums with the sound of thousands of hammers striking steel. Sparks cascade like falling stars, and the skeletal frame of something magnificent rises from the Harland and Wolff shipyard. This was the birthplace of dreams made manifest in rivets and steel plates, the RMS Titanic. The world of 1912 was intoxicated with progress. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps in the great cities. Automobiles, though still rare, puttered down cobblestone streets alongside horse-drawn carriages. The Wright brothers had only recently taught humanity to fly, and now the skies themselves seemed within reach. It was an era when each new invention seemed to promise that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle nature might present. In this atmosphere of boundless optimism, ocean liners represented the pinnacle of technological achievement and social sophistication. They were more than ships, they were floating cities, carrying not just passengers and cargo, but hopes, dreams, and the very spirit of an age that believed tomorrow would always be better than today. The Titanic was conceived in this spirit of supreme confidence. Her designers envisioned a vessel that would redefine luxury travel, a ship so large and so well appointed that she would make her competitors seem quaint by comparison. When J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, first outlined his vision, he spoke of creating not merely a ship, but a work of art that happened to float. Picture the drawing rooms where these plans first took shape. Gentlemen in morning coats bent over blueprints, their voices soft with reverence as they discussed grand staircases that would rival those of European palaces, dining rooms that could seat hundreds in splendour, and staterooms that would make the finest hotels seem modest. They spoke of Turkish baths, a gymnasium, even a squash court. The Titanic would be a world unto herself, carrying civilization itself across the Atlantic. The ship's very name carried weight and promise. Titanic, after the titans of Greek mythology, those primordial beings of enormous power. The name suggested something beyond a mere human scale, something that partook of the divine. When newspapers first began writing about the ship under construction, they used words like Leviathan and floating palace. She was, they proclaimed, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the Empire's maritime supremacy. In the quiet hours of Belfast shipyard, when the day shift had gone home and only the night watchman remained, the Titanic's hull rested like a sleeping giant. Her steel plates, each one carefully crafted and fitted, gleamed under the electric lights that had been strung throughout the yard. The ship seemed to pulse with potential, as if she were merely waiting for the moment when she could slip her bonds and take to the sea for which she had been created. The workers who built her spoke of the Titanic with a mixture of pride and affection that bordered on the mystical. Irish craftsmen, many of them carrying on traditions passed down through generations, poured their skills into every rivet, every joint, every carefully turned piece of trim. They worked knowing they were creating something unprecedented, something that would carry the reputation of their city and their craft to the far corners of the world. As 1912 dawned, the Titanic neared completion, and with each passing day the anticipation grew more intense. Photographers came to document her progress. Journalists filed breathless reports about her dimensions, her amenities, her revolutionary safety features. The public imagination was captured completely. Here was tangible proof that the new century would be an age of wonders. Yet in this atmosphere of celebration and expectation, few paused to consider the ancient relationship between human ambition and the sea's eternal indifference. The ocean had been claiming ships since humans first learned to sail, and it would continue to do so regardless of how advanced those ships might be. But such thoughts seemed irrelevant in an age of steel and steam, when human engineering appeared to have finally mastered the natural world. The Atlantic Ocean in 1912 was not merely a barrier to be crossed, but a stage upon which the great drama of international commerce and travel played out daily. For more than 50 years, steamships had been racing across its waters, each generation of vessels larger, faster, and more luxurious than the last. The ocean had become humanity's highway, and the great liners were its kings. The competition was fierce and relentless. Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania held the speed records, their turbine engines driving them across the Atlantic at unprecedented velocities. These ships were marvels of engineering, their sleek hulls cutting through the waves like knives, their powerful engines consuming coal at prodigious rates in pursuit of ever faster crossing times. The Blue Riband, awarded to the fastest passenger ship on the North Atlantic route, was a prize coveted by shipping lines and a source of national pride. But the White Star Line, under the leadership of J. Bruce Ismay, chose a different strategy. Rather than competing solely on speed, they would compete on size and luxury. Their ships would be floating palaces, offering accommodations and amenities that no land-based hotel could match. The journey itself would become the destination, a week-long experience of pampered elegance that would make passengers reluctant to disembark. Imagine the grand saloon of a typical Atlantic liner of this era. Electric chandeliers cast warm light over rich wood panelling and gilt decoration. Passengers in evening dress gather for dinner, the ladies in silk gowns with elaborate trains, the gentlemen in white tie and tails. The ship's orchestra plays softly from a corner alcove, their music mingling with the gentle conversation and the soft clink of crystal and silver. Outside the tall windows, the ocean stretches endlessly, but inside one might forget entirely that one is at sea. This was the world that ocean liners created, a world suspended between the old country and the new, between what passengers were leaving behind and what they hoped to find. For the wealthy, it was an extension of their comfortable lives, allowing them to travel without sacrificing any of the luxuries to which they were accustomed. For immigrants in steerage, it was a week of crowded but hopeful anticipation, each day bringing them closer to a new life in America. The social rituals of liner travel had evolved into an elaborate dance. Passengers dressed for dinner, promenaded on deck during prescribed hours, and gathered in the ship's public rooms for conversation and entertainment. Romances bloomed in the soft light of the ship's saloons. Business deals were struck over cigars in the smoking room. Children played on deck while their parents watched indulgently from deck chairs. But beneath this civilized veneer lay the eternal reality of the sea. The Atlantic in April is cold and dangerous, its waters filled with icebergs that have broken away from Greenland's glaciers and drifted south on the Labrador Current. These floating mountains of ice, most of their mass hidden beneath the surface, posed a constant threat to shipping. Yet the busy sea lanes continued to operate, captains relying on their experience, their wireless operators, and their faith in their ship's construction to see them safely across. The ocean liner routes had become so regular, so predictable, that they operated almost like railroad schedules. Ships departed on time, followed established courses, and arrived when expected. This regularity bred a kind of complacency, a sense that the ocean had been tamed and made predictable. The sea, however, has never been truly tamed, and on certain cold April nights, it reminds humanity of its eternal power. As the White Star Line's newest ships took shape, the company's ambitions grew ever more grandiose. The Olympic, launched in 1910, was the first of the new class, and she immediately set new standards for size and luxury. But she was merely the prelude to something even grander. Her sister ship, still under construction in Belfast, would surpass even the Olympic's magnificence. In the shipyards of Belfast, where the Titanic slowly took shape, the sound of human industry never ceased. Day and night, workers laboured to create something that had never existed before. A ship so large and so completely appointed that she would redefine what was possible on the world's oceans. The hammering of rivets created a rhythmic percussion that echoed across the Lagan River, a sound that spoke of human determination and infinite ambition. Picture the Harland and Wolff shipyard in the winter of 1911. Snow dust the massive gantries that tower over the Titanic's hull, and electric lights create pools of warm illumination in the gathering dusk. Thousands of workers bundled against the cold continue their labour. The ship herself rises from her building dock like a metal mountain, her hull plates black against the white snow, her superstructure reaching toward the grey Belfast sky. The men who built the Titanic were craftsmen in the truest sense, many of them inheriting their skills from fathers and grandfathers who had worked in Belfast shipyards for generations. They could read steel the way others read books, understanding its strength and limitations through touch and experience. Each rivet they drove, each plate they fitted, was placed with the knowledge that lives would depend on their work. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, walked these decks daily during construction, his trained eye catching details that others might miss. He was a man obsessed with perfection, constantly refining and improving his design. In his mind, the Titanic was not just a commercial venture, but a work of art. A symphony composed in steel and powered by steam. He envisioned passengers walking her decks and marvelling not just at her size, but at the elegance and thoughtfulness of every detail. The ship's safety features were revolutionary for their time. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by massive bulkheads that could be sealed at the throw of a switch from the bridge. The theory was simple and reassuring. Even if the ship were damaged, the watertight compartments would prevent flooding from spreading throughout the hull. The Titanic could survive the flooding of any 2 adjacent compartments, and even some combinations of 3 or 4 compartments, and still remain afloat. This design led to the famous claim that the ship was practically unsinkable. The phrase appeared in trade publications and was repeated by journalists and company officials. To the public, practically unsinkable became simply unsinkable, and the Titanic acquired an aura of invincibility that would prove tragically misplaced. Yet at the time, given the state of naval architecture and the ship's advanced safety features, the confidence seemed justified. The double bottom that ran along most of the ship's length provided additional protection against damage from grounding or collision. The steel plates that formed her hull were the finest available, and the rivets that held them together were driven by the most skilled workers in the shipyard. Every aspect of the ship's construction reflected the best practices of the era, and her builders had every reason to believe they had created something unprecedented in its safety and reliability. As winter gave way to spring in 1912, the Titanic neared completion. Her 4 massive funnels, each large enough to drive 2 railway trains through, were painted in the White Star Line's distinctive buff and black colours. Her superstructure gleamed with fresh white paint, and her hull wore a coat of black paint that would shine like glass when she met the sun. The ship was becoming not just functional but beautiful, a moving work of art that would grace the world's oceans. The final touches were applied with the same care that had characterized the entire construction process. The grand staircase with its ornate clock and cherub was installed piece by piece. The first-class staterooms received their fine furniture and silk hangings. The dining saloons were fitted with their crystal chandeliers and fine china. Every detail spoke of luxury and comfort, but also of the confidence of an age that believed human skill could overcome any challenge. On a crisp morning in April 1912, the RMS Titanic left Belfast for the last time, bound for Southampton and her appointment with destiny. As she steamed down Belfast Lough, her builders and designers watched from the shore, their hearts swelling with pride. They had created something magnificent, something that would carry the reputation of Belfast craftsmanship to the far corners of the world. The ship moved through the water with a grace that belied her enormous size, her engines purring with quiet power, her hull cutting cleanly through the gentle swells. Those who watched her depart could not have known they were witnessing the end of an era as much as the beginning of a voyage. The Titanic represented the pinnacle of human confidence in technology and engineering, but she was sailing toward an encounter that would humble that confidence forever. Yet in that moment, as she steamed toward the Irish Sea with her flags flying and her whistle sounding farewell, she embodied all the hopes and dreams of the age that created her. The morning of April the 10th, 1912, dawned bright and clear over Southampton. The Titanic, having completed her sea trials and journey from Belfast, lay alongside Ocean Dock, her massive hull dwarfing everything around her. From a distance she appeared almost impossibly large, her 4 funnels reaching toward the sky like the smokestacks of some great factory. Yet as passengers approached, they discovered that her size only enhanced her elegance. She was a giant, yes, but a graceful giant, designed with an eye for proportion and beauty that made her seem less like a machine than like a living thing. The boarding process began early, with passengers arriving in carriages and motor cars, their luggage following in carts and wagons. The scene on the dock was one of controlled excitement, as travellers prepared to embark on what many considered the most luxurious voyage available anywhere in the world. Stewards in crisp white uniforms stood ready to escort passengers to their accommodations, their manner attentive but unobtrusive, trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. First-class passengers entered through the grand entrance amidships, immediately finding themselves in surroundings that rivaled the finest hotels in London or New York. The grand staircase rose before them in all its ornate glory, its oak panelling gleaming under electric light, its elaborate clock crowned by the carved figures of honour and glory. The staircase was more than functional architecture, it was theatre, designed to make every descent into the main saloon a grand entrance worthy of the finest drawing rooms of Europe. The first-class accommodations aboard the Titanic represented the absolute pinnacle of luxury travel. The most expensive suites featured sitting rooms, bedrooms, and private bathrooms with running water, amenities that were far from common in 1912. The furniture was crafted from the finest woods and upholstered in silk and velvet. Electric heating provided warmth, and electric lighting could be adjusted to create exactly the right ambience for any occasion. Passengers could ring for stewards at any hour, and their requests would be fulfilled with the efficiency of a grand hotel. Picture yourself walking through these first-class accommodations in the hours before departure. Sunlight streams through large portholes, illuminating rich fabrics and polished wood. The corridors are wide and graciously proportioned, their walls covered in fine panelling and decorated with tasteful artwork. The atmosphere is one of quiet refinement, where every detail has been considered and perfected. This was luxury as it was understood by the Edwardian elite. Substantial, comfortable and slightly formal, but warm and welcoming in its elegance. The second-class accommodations, while not as lavish as first-class, were nevertheless superior to first-class accommodations on many other ships. Second-class passengers enjoyed private cabins with comfortable beds, electric lighting, and shared bathroom facilities that were kept immaculately clean. The second-class dining saloon featured the same high-quality food as first-class, served on fine china with silver utensils. For many second-class passengers, the voyage represented a level of luxury they had never before experienced. But it was in third class, or steerage, that the Titanic's true humanity revealed itself. While these accommodations were modest by comparison to the upper classes, they were remarkably comfortable for their time. Third-class passengers had access to their own dining saloon, their own promenade spaces, and cabins that, while small, were clean and adequately furnished. Many immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic in previous decades could hardly believe the comfort and dignity with which they were treated aboard the Titanic. Among the third-class passengers were families seeking new lives in America, young men hoping to make their fortunes, and women travelling to marry fiancés they had not seen in months or years. Their stories were often more dramatic than those of the wealthy passengers above, for they were not merely travelling but emigrating, leaving behind everything they had ever known for the uncertain promise of a new world. Their luggage contained not luxury items but necessities, photographs of loved ones, precious family heirlooms, and the tools of their trades. As departure time approached, the ship's crew made final preparations. In the engine rooms, coal was shoveled into the massive boilers that would power the ship's engines. The Titanic required nearly 700 tons of coal per day to maintain her cruising speed, and her bunkers held enough fuel for the entire Atlantic crossing. The engines themselves were marvels of engineering. Two massive reciprocating engines that drove the outer propellers, and a steam turbine that powered the central propeller. Together they could drive the ship through the water at a comfortable 21 knots, fast enough to maintain schedule but not so fast as to sacrifice comfort for speed. On this bridge, Captain Edward Smith reviewed the charts and weather reports for the crossing. Smith was a veteran of the Atlantic routes, a man whose experience and skill had earned him the nickname the Millionaire's Captain for his popularity among wealthy passengers. This was to be his final voyage before retirement, the culmination of a long and distinguished career at sea. He had commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, and his reputation for safety and reliability was unmatched. The ship's officers conducted final inspections, checking safety equipment, reviewing emergency procedures, and ensuring that every detail was in perfect order. The lifeboats were tested and found ready, though few gave much thought to their potential use. On a ship as advanced and well-built as the Titanic, the lifeboats were considered little more than a regulatory requirement, unlikely ever to be needed for their intended purpose. At noon, the Titanic's massive whistles sounded the departure signal, their deep voices echoing across Southampton water. The ship's lines were cast off and she began to move slowly away from the dock, her engines turning at dead slow as she manoeuvred through the busy harbour. Passengers lined the rails, waving to friends and family on the shore, handkerchiefs fluttering in the spring breeze. The band played cheerful tunes, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and anticipation. As the Titanic cleared Southampton water and entered the Solent, she began to reveal her true grace and power. The massive ship moved through the water with surprising elegance, her hull cutting cleanly through the gentle swells, her engines providing smooth and steady power. Passengers who'd been concerned about seasickness found that the ship's great size provided remarkable stability. She rode the waves like an island, barely acknowledging the motion of the sea beneath her. The first afternoon and evening aboard the Titanic established the rhythms that would characterize the voyage. Passengers settled into their accommodations, explored the ship's public spaces, and began to form the social connections that would define their week at sea. In the first-class lounge, gentlemen discussed business and politics over cigars and brandy. In the second-class smoking room, conversation was equally animated, but perhaps more democratic. In third class, families gathered in the common areas, children playing while parents planned for their new lives in America. The ship's restaurant served meals that rivaled those of the finest hotels in Europe. The a la carte restaurant, reserved for first-class passengers willing to pay extra for the privilege, offered cuisine prepared by the French chefs using the finest ingredients. The main dining saloons in all classes served elaborate meals prepared to exacting standards. Even in third class, passengers dined on roast beef, fresh vegetables, and desserts that would have been considered luxurious in many of their home countries. As night fell on April 10th, the Titanic settled into her crossing routine. Electric lights twinkled from her portholes like stars, and the soft glow from her public rooms created an atmosphere of warmth and civilization in the vast darkness of the ocean. The ship's orchestra played in the first-class lounge, their music drifting through the corridors and adding to the sense that this was not merely transportation, but an experience to be savoured. In the wireless room, operator Jack Phillips worked diligently to clear the backlog of passenger messages that had accumulated during the ship's stay in port. The wireless was still a relatively new technology, and passengers were fascinated by the ability to send messages across the ocean. Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride worked in shifts, maintaining contact with other ships and shore stations, handling both commercial traffic and ship's business with equal attention to detail. The first day of the voyage established the Titanic as everything her builders and operators had promised she would be. She was stable, comfortable, luxurious, and seemingly invincible. Passengers who had initially been awed by her size now began to appreciate the thoughtfulness of her design and the quality of her service. This was travel as it was meant to be, civilized, comfortable, and elegant, with the journey itself becoming a memorable part of the experience. The days at sea aboard the Titanic fell into a gentle rhythm that seemed to slow time itself. Morning came softly, announced not by harsh alarm clocks but by the quiet sounds of stewards preparing the ship for another day. Passengers awakened to find their clothes pressed and waiting, their shoes polished to a perfect shine, and fresh flowers in their stateroom vases. The ship moved so smoothly through the calm seas that one could forget entirely that they were travelling at 21 knots across the North Atlantic. After breakfast, the first ritual of the day was the morning constitutional, a gentle walk around the ship's promenade decks. The Titanic's boat deck stretched for hundreds of feet, providing ample space for passengers to stroll while breathing the crisp ocean air. Stewards arranged deck chairs in sheltered areas where passengers could sit and read, write letters, or simply watch the endless expanse of ocean roll past. The ship's wake stretched behind them like a white road on the blue water, marking their passage across the Atlantic. The contrast between the classes was most evident during these quiet morning hours. First-class passengers promenaded on the boat deck and A-deck, their walking areas protected from wind and spray by elegant glass screens. They moved at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to chat with fellow passengers or to admire the view. Their clothing reflected their status, the gentlemen in fine wool coats and silk scarves, the ladies in elaborate walking dresses with furs and jewellery that sparkled in the morning light. Second-class passengers had their own promenade areas, less protected from the elements but no less pleasant for those who enjoyed the invigorating salt air. Here the conversations were more animated, the social barriers less rigid. Friendships formed quickly among second-class passengers, perhaps because they shared a middle ground between the formality of first class and the crowded conditions of steerage. Third-class passengers found their own spaces for morning exercise, areas that were modest but adequate for their needs. Families gathered in small groups, parents watching their children play while discussing their hopes for America. The conversations were often multilingual, with passengers from Ireland mixing with those from Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Despite the language barriers, a sense of community developed among these travellers, united by their shared dreams of a better life in the New World. The ship's daily routine was punctuated by the sound of bugle calls and the gentle chiming of the ship's bells. Breakfast was served in elegant dining saloons where white-coated stewards moved with practiced efficiency, their service so smooth it seemed choreographed. The food was remarkable not just for its quality but for its variety. Fresh eggs and bacon, imported fruits, fine pastries and coffee that was somehow better than anything served on land. After breakfast, passengers dispersed to their chosen activities. The Titanic offered amenities that were unprecedented on any ocean liner. The gymnasium located on the boat deck featured the latest exercise equipment, including rowing machines, stationary bicycles, and electric horses that provided gentle exercise for those who preferred not to exert themselves too strenuously. The Turkish bath offered a more exotic form of relaxation, with steam rooms and cooling chambers that provided relief from the sometimes stuffy atmosphere of the ship's interior. For those seeking intellectual stimulation, the ship's library provided a quiet refuge filled with books in multiple languages. The reading room adjacent to the library offered comfortable chairs and good light for those who wished to write letters or catch up on newspapers and magazines. The ship's daily newspaper, printed aboard using wireless reports, kept passengers informed of events in the outside world, though the news seemed somehow less urgent when read in the peaceful surroundings of the ship. The afternoon brought its own rhythms and rituals. Tea was served in the various lounges, accompanied by small sandwiches, cakes and pastries that made the afternoon meal an event in itself. Passengers gathered in small groups, conversation flowing as freely as the tea. These afternoon gatherings were where friendships deepened and romances began, the intimate setting of the ship creating bonds that might have taken months to form on land. Children aboard the Titanic found their own adventures and entertainments. The ship's long corridors became highways for games of tag, and the open deck spaces provided room for more vigorous play. The crew was generally tolerant of children's activities, understanding that a week at sea could seem very long to young minds. Parents watched their children play with a mixture of indulgence and anxiety, aware that they were travelling toward an uncertain future but determined to make the journey itself as pleasant as possible for their families. Evenings aboard the Titanic were the most elegant part of each day. Passengers dressed for dinner with the same care they would have shown at the finest restaurants on land. In first class, this meant full formal wear, white tie and tails for gentlemen, elaborate gowns for ladies. The transformation that occurred each evening was remarkable, as the ship's passengers shed their daytime informality and became a glittering society that would have graced any ballroom in Europe or America. The first-class dining saloon was a vision of Edwardian elegance, with its elaborate plasterwork ceiling, its fine wood panelling, and its rows of tables set with crystal, silver, and fine china. Each evening's menu was a masterpiece of culinary art, featuring multiple courses of the finest food available anywhere in the world. The conversation at dinner was animated but civilized, with passengers discussing literature, politics, business, and travel with the easy confidence of people accustomed to the best society. Music was an integral part of the ship's evening entertainment. The ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, provided a soundtrack to the voyage that enhanced every activity. During dinner, they played softly from the reception room adjacent to the dining saloon, their music floating through the air like an audio perfume that made even ordinary conversations seem more significant. After dinner, they moved to the lounge areas where passengers gathered for coffee, liqueurs, and conversation that often continued well into the night. The ship's public rooms in the evening became theatres of human drama. In the smoking room, gentlemen gathered around card tables or engaged in serious discussions of business and politics. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the quiet intensity of men at leisure but still engaged with the serious business of their lives. In the lounge areas, mixed company created a more diverse social environment where the conversation ranged more widely and the atmosphere was somewhat less formal. But perhaps the most magical time aboard the Titanic was the late evening, when most passengers had retired and the ship settled into her nighttime routine. The public rooms were dimmed but not dark, creating intimate spaces where a few passengers continued their conversations or simply sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the gentle motion of the ship and the sense of being suspended between worlds. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast, dark expanse broken only by the ship's running lights and the occasional glimpse of stars through the North Atlantic's often cloudy skies. The ship's crew worked through the night to maintain the high standards that characterized every aspect of the voyage. Stewards prepared staterooms for the night, turning down beds and ensuring that everything was ready for passengers' comfort. In the engine rooms, firemen continued the endless process of feeding coal to the boilers that powered the ship across the ocean. On the bridge, officers maintained their watches, monitoring the ship's progress and watching for other vessels or any signs of danger. These peaceful days and nights created a sense of timelessness that made the voyage seem like a temporary escape from the ordinary world. Passengers began to form attachments not just to each other, but to the ship herself, speaking of the Titanic with the affection usually reserved for homes or beloved places. The ship had become more than transportation. She was a world unto herself, a floating society that existed independently of the land-bound world they had left behind and the uncertain future that awaited them in America. As the Titanic made her way steadily westward, wireless messages began arriving with increasing frequency, messages that would have seemed routine to the officers who received them, but which, in retrospect, carried the weight of destiny. The North Atlantic in April was dangerous water, filled with ice that had broken away from the glaciers of Greenland and drifted south on the cold Labrador Current. These icebergs, some as large as buildings, posed a constant threat to shipping, and the wireless network that connected ships at sea was filled with warnings and sightings. The ice warnings began arriving on April 12th, 2 days into the voyage. The first came from the French liner La Touraine, which reported ice and field ice in the track of westbound steamers. The message was routine, the kind of navigational information that ships regularly shared with each other. Captain Smith acknowledged the warning and made a small adjustment to the ship's course, a precautionary measure that was standard practice when ice was reported in the shipping lanes. But as April 13th dawned, more warnings arrived. The German steamer America reported 2 large icebergs in a position that was directly in the Titanic's path. The Leyland liner Californian reported ice, bergs, and field ice. Each message was received, acknowledged, and filed, but the accumulation of warnings began to paint a picture of an ice field of unusual extent and density for so early in the season. The atmosphere aboard the Titanic remained one of calm confidence. Passengers continued their routines of meals, walks, and conversation, largely unaware of the navigational concerns that occupied their officers. The ship was making excellent time, maintaining her schedule despite the small course adjustments made to avoid the reported ice. The weather remained fine, with clear skies and calm seas that made the crossing exceptionally pleasant. Captain Smith was approaching retirement after a long and distinguished career, and this voyage was intended to be his farewell to the sea. He was known throughout the shipping industry as a careful and experienced navigator, a man who had never lost a ship or suffered a serious accident in decades of command. His reputation was such that wealthy passengers specifically requested passage on ships under his command, trusting their safety to his skill and experience. The ship's officers shared their captain's confidence and experience. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, and the other members of the deck department were all veteran seamen who had spent years navigating the North Atlantic. They understood the dangers of ice and fog, but they also understood the capabilities of their ship and their own skills in handling her. The Titanic was equipped with the most advanced navigation equipment available, and her officers were trained to use it effectively. As the afternoon of April 13th wore on, more ice warnings arrived. The steamer Nordam reported ice in the same general area that previous warnings had indicated. The Baltic sent a message reporting large icebergs 5 miles south of the steamer track. Each warning was duly noted, but none seemed to warrant any dramatic change in the ship's routine or speed. The evening of April 13th was particularly beautiful, with clear skies and a calm sea that reflected the stars like a mirror. Passengers gathered on deck to enjoy the mild weather and the spectacular view of the night sky, unobstructed by the lights of cities or the haze of industrial pollution. The Titanic's own lights created a pool of civilization in the vast darkness, and the gentle throb of her engines provided a reassuring rhythm that spoke of power and reliability. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips worked steadily to clear the backlog of passenger messages. The Titanic's wireless equipment was the most powerful available, capable of communicating with shore stations and other ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. Phillips took pride in his work, knowing that the messages he transmitted connected passengers with their loved ones and business associates across the vast distances of the Atlantic. But Phillips was also aware of the ice warnings that continued to arrive throughout the day. As a veteran wireless operator, he understood the significance of the reports and the danger they represented. The ice field appeared to be larger and more extensive than usual for the time of year, and it lay directly across the shipping lanes used by westbound vessels. The night of April 13th passed peacefully, with the Titanic maintaining her course and speed through calm seas. The ship's routine continued undisturbed. The evening entertainment, the late dinners, the quiet conversations in the smoking rooms and lounges. Passengers retired to their staterooms confident in their ship and their officers, secure in the belief that the morning would bring them another day closer to their destination. But in the early hours of April 14th, the temperature began to drop noticeably. The ship was entering the region where the warm Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current, creating conditions that not only favoured the formation of fog, but also brought icebergs further south than they typically travelled. The officers on watch noted the temperature change and increased their vigilance, knowing that cold air often preceded encounters with ice. The morning of April 14th, 1912 dawned crisp and clear, with a brilliant sun shining on seas that were unusually calm for the North Atlantic. The Titanic continued her westward course at a steady 21 knots, her passengers awakening to what promised to be another pleasant day of the voyage. Few could have imagined that this would be their last full day aboard the great ship, or that the peaceful morning concealed the approach of a tragedy that would echo through history. The wireless messages that arrived throughout April 14th carried an increasingly urgent tone, though their significance was not immediately apparent to those who received them. The steamer Coronia reported bergs, growlers and field ice in the vicinity of the Titanic's track. The Baltic sent coordinates for large icebergs and field ice. The America reported icebergs and large amounts of field ice in the exact position the Titanic would reach later that day. Each message was received and acknowledged, but the accumulation of warnings seemed to have little impact on the ship's operations. The Titanic continued at her normal speed, her officers confident in their ability to navigate safely through whatever ice they might encounter. The ship's lookouts were instructed to maintain careful watch, but the general atmosphere remained one of routine confidence rather than special alertness. Captain Smith, in consultation with his officers, made small adjustments to the ship's course, steering slightly south of the usual track to avoid the worst of the reported ice. These adjustments were prudent and followed standard practice, but they were not dramatic enough to significantly alter the ship's schedule or disturb her passengers' routine. The Titanic was still expected to arrive in New York on schedule, and nothing in the day's operations suggested that this expectation would not be fulfilled. The passengers continued their shipboard routines, blissfully unaware of the navigational challenges facing their officers. The morning constitutional around the promenade decks was particularly pleasant, with the clear air and sunshine making the ocean appear benign and welcoming. Passengers commented on the unusual calmness of the sea, noting that they had experienced none of the rough weather that often characterized North Atlantic crossings. As the day progressed, more ice warnings arrived. The German steamer America reported passing 2 large icebergs in the vicinity of the Titanic's intended track. The Hydrographic Office in Washington sent a warning about ice between 42 degrees north and 41 degrees 25 north longitude, 49 degrees to 50 degrees 30s and west. The Mesaba reported heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs in the same general area. But the most significant warning of the day came from the Californian, a ship of the Leyland Line that was stopped in the ice field directly ahead of the Titanic's position. The Californian's radio operator attempted to warn the Titanic of the dangerous ice conditions, but his message was cut short by Jack Phillips, who was busy with passenger traffic and curtly told the Californian to stay out of his frequency. This exchange, lasting only a few moments, would later be recognized as one of the crucial missed opportunities of the disaster. The Californian was stopped in the ice field that the Titanic was approaching at full speed. Her captain, Stanley Lord, had decided that the ice was too dangerous to navigate in darkness and had stopped his ship for the night. If Phillips had listened to the Californian's warning, the Titanic might have taken similar precautions. As evening approached on April 14th, the temperature continued to drop rapidly. The ship's officers noted the dramatic change, with the thermometer falling from a comfortable 50 degrees in the afternoon to near freezing, as darkness fell. This temperature drop was a classic sign of proximity to ice, and the watch officers increased their alertness accordingly. The evening routine aboard the Titanic proceeded normally despite the growing cold. Passengers dressed for dinner with their usual care, and the dining saloons filled with the familiar sounds of conversation and the quiet efficiency of the serving staff. The ship's orchestra played their regular dinner selections, and the atmosphere remained one of civilized comfort and routine elegance. But outside, conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. The sea remained unusually calm, so calm that there was no phosphorescence or foam around icebergs that might make them visible in the darkness. The night was moonless and exceptionally dark, with only starlight to illuminate the water. These conditions, while pleasant for passengers enjoying the evening air on deck, created a perfect scenario for disaster. In the Crow's Nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee began their watch at 10 p.m, peering into the darkness ahead of the ship. They had been warned to watch for ice, but they faced nearly impossible conditions. Without binoculars, which had been left behind in Southampton due to a last-minute change in personnel, they had to rely on their eyes alone to spot danger in the darkness ahead. The ship's officers on the bridge maintained their routine watches, but they too were hampered by the extraordinary conditions. The combination of the moonless night, the calm sea, and the clear but dark sky created a situation where icebergs would be nearly invisible until the ship was dangerously close to them. Yet the Titanic continued at her normal speed, her officers confident in their ability to stop or maneuver if danger appeared. As the evening progressed, passengers began retiring to their staterooms, many commenting on the beautiful starlight and the remarkable calmness of the sea. The ship's public rooms gradually emptied, though the smoking room and some of the lounges remained active with passengers who preferred to stay up late, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere and the gentle motion of the great ship. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips continued his work, handling the steady stream of passenger messages while occasionally receiving and acknowledging navigational warnings from other ships. He was tired from long hours of work, but he was dedicated to clearing the backlog of messages that had accumulated during the voyage. The wireless was still a novelty for many passengers, and they delighted in sending messages to friends and family, keeping Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride busy throughout the day and evening. The final ice warning of the day arrived at 9:40 p.m. from the steamer Masaba, reporting heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs in the exact position the Titanic would reach within hours. This message, perhaps the most critical of all the warnings received, never reached the bridge. Phillips was overwhelmed with passenger traffic and either missed the significance of the message or failed to deliver it to the officers who needed it most. As Sunday, April 14th, 1912 drew to a close, the Titanic raced through the night toward her appointment with destiny. Her passengers slept peacefully in their comfortable staterooms, secure in their belief in the ship's invincibility and their officers' skill. The great ship's engines turned steadily, driving her through the calm seas at 22.5 knots, slightly faster than her normal cruising speed, as Captain Smith attempted to make up time lost to the course changes necessitated by the ice warnings. The stars shone brilliantly in the clear cold air, their light reflecting off the glassy surface of the sea. The Titanic's own lights created a moving constellation on the dark ocean, a symbol of human achievement and confidence sailing toward the greatest maritime disaster in history. In less than 2 hours, the ship that was practically unsinkable would strike an iceberg and begin her descent to the ocean floor, taking with her more than 1,500 souls and the unbounded optimism of an age that believed technology could conquer nature itself. At 11:40 p.m, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something in the darkness ahead. Squinting into the night, he made out the unmistakable shape of an iceberg directly in the ship's path. Fleet immediately rang the Crow's Nest bell 3 times and picked up the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead!" he called, his voice carrying the urgency of imminent danger. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch received Fleet's warning and he immediately took action. "Hard a starboard," he called to the helmsman, then reached for the engine room telegraph and signalled "full astern." He also activated the switch that would close the watertight doors throughout the ship, hoping to contain any damage that might occur. These were the correct actions, the responses that years of training and experience had prepared him to make, but they came too late to avoid disaster. The Titanic began to turn, her massive bulk responding slowly to the helm. For a moment it seemed as though the ship might clear the iceberg, sliding past it into the safety of open water. Murdoch and the other officers on the bridge watched tensely as the dark mass of ice drew closer, hoping against hope that their evasive maneuvers would be sufficient. But the laws of physics cannot be overcome by hope or skill. The Titanic was simply too large and moving too fast to avoid the collision entirely. Instead of striking the iceberg head-on, which might have been survivable, the ship's starboard side scraped along the ice, creating a series of punctures and gashes below the waterline. The impact was surprisingly gentle. Many passengers felt nothing more than a slight vibration or a barely perceptible jar. The collision lasted less than 40 seconds, but in that brief time the Titanic's fate was sealed. The iceberg had opened the ship's hull along nearly 300 feet of her length, flooding 6 of her 16 watertight compartments. The ship had been designed to survive the flooding of 4 compartments, possibly even 5 under certain circumstances, but 6 compartments doomed her to destruction. Captain Smith rushed to the bridge immediately after the collision, demanding to know what had happened. After a brief explanation from Murdoch, Smith ordered the engines stopped and sent for Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was aboard for the maiden voyage. Together, Smith and Andrews descended into the ship to assess the damage, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. Water was pouring into the forward compartments at a rate that made the ship's fate inevitable. The watertight bulkheads, which had been designed to contain flooding, extended only to E-deck, and as the ship settled by the head, water would flow over the tops of the bulkheads and flood additional compartments in sequence. Andrews, with his intimate knowledge of the ship's construction, calculated that the Titanic had perhaps an hour and a half before she would founder. The news that the Unsinkable ship was indeed sinking spread slowly through the ship. Many passengers, awakened by the sound of the collision, or by stewards instructing them to put on life jackets, found it difficult to believe that they were in serious danger. The ship seemed stable, her lights were still burning brightly, and her list was barely perceptible. Surely, they reasoned, a ship as advanced and well-built as the Titanic could survive a collision with ice. But in the depths of the ship, the reality was undeniable. Water continued to pour through the damaged hull, and the ship's pumps, powerful as they were, could not cope with the volume of flooding. The mailroom was already underwater, and postal workers were seen carrying sacks of mail to higher decks in a futile attempt to save them. In the squash court, water was rising rapidly, and the gymnasium on the upper deck would soon be affected as the ship's bow settled deeper into the sea. Captain Smith, faced with the unthinkable reality that his ship was doomed, began the process of awakening passengers and preparing for evacuation. The order to uncover the lifeboats was given, and the ship's crew began the complex process of preparing the boats for launching. Many crew members had never participated in a full-scale boat drill, and the process was complicated by the darkness, the confusion of awakening passengers, and the gradually increasing list of the ship. The wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, began sending distress signals, first using the traditional CQD call and then the newer SOS signal. Their messages went out into the night, carrying the incredible news that the Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, was sinking and needed immediate assistance. Ships within range began altering course toward the Titanic's position, but the nearest vessel, the Carpathia, was still 4 hours away. The reality of the situation began to penetrate the consciousness of passengers and crew alike. This was not a drill or a precautionary measure. The Titanic was actually sinking, and the lifeboats that had seemed like mere decoration were now their only hope of survival. The ship that had been a symbol of human achievement and technological progress was succumbing to the eternal power of the sea, and nearly 2,300 souls found themselves facing a situation that their comfortable world had not prepared them to confront. As the full scope of the disaster became apparent, a curious mix of panic and calm settled over the ship. Some passengers rushed to the boat deck in various states of dress, while others took time to dress formally, as if they were going to a dinner party rather than abandoning ship. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, began playing music in the first-class lounge, their melodies providing a backdrop of civilization and order to the growing chaos. The early hours of April 15, 1912 became a test of human character played out against the backdrop of the greatest maritime disaster in history. In the face of certain death, some passengers and crew members displayed remarkable courage and selflessness, while others succumbed to panic and self-interest. The women and children first protocol was generally observed, but its implementation was uneven and sometimes chaotic. The lifeboats themselves became symbols of the social divisions that had characterized the ship during her brief voyage. First-class passengers had easier access to the boats and were more likely to find places in them. Third-class passengers, housed deep in the ship and unfamiliar with the layout of the upper decks, faced greater challenges in reaching the boat deck and were often hindered by locked gates and barriers that separated the classes even in this moment of supreme crisis. As the night progressed and the ship's condition worsened, the true magnitude of the disaster became undeniable. The Titanic, which had left Southampton with such confidence and optimism, was dying in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, and more than half of those aboard would die with her. The process of loading and launching the lifeboats proceeded with tragic inefficiency. Many boats left the ship only partially filled, taking away precious spaces that could have saved additional lives. The crew's unfamiliarity with the new davit system contributed to the confusion, as did the darkness and the growing list of the ship. Passengers who had never contemplated the possibility of abandoning ship found themselves facing a 60-foot drop to the dark water below, and many understandably hesitated to make that terrifying leap of faith. Boat number 7, the first to be launched, left the ship at 12:45 a.m. with only 27 people aboard, though it could have carried 65. This pattern of underloading would be repeated throughout the night, as officers erred on the side of caution, fearing that fully loaded boats might buckle or break as they were lowered. The boats had been tested to carry their full complement, but in the stress and confusion of the emergency, theoretical knowledge gave way to conservative caution that ultimately cost hundreds of lives. The ship's electric lights continued to burn brightly throughout the early stages of the evacuation, powered by the heroic efforts of the engineering crew who remained at their posts to keep the generators running. This light was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed the evacuation to proceed with some degree of order, but it also made it difficult for passengers to grasp the full seriousness of their situation. How could a ship that was still brilliantly lit and apparently stable be in mortal danger? As more boats were launched, the stories of individual courage and sacrifice began to emerge. Benjamin Guggenheim, the wealthy mining heir, helped women and children into the boats before retiring to his stateroom to dress in evening clothes, reportedly saying he was prepared to go down like a gentleman. Ida Strauss, wife of Macy's owner Isidor Strauss, refused to leave her husband's side, saying, "Where you go, I go." Their love story became one of the most poignant tales of the disaster. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was seen throughout the evacuation helping passengers find life jackets and encouraging them to board the lifeboats. He knew better than anyone that the ship was doomed, and he spent his final hours not in despair, but in service to others. He was last seen in the smoking room, staring at a painting of Plymouth Harbour, perhaps contemplating the irony that his greatest creation had become his tomb. Captain Smith moved through the ship during the evacuation, checking that all passengers had been awakened and encouraging the crew in their duties. As the senior officer, he bore ultimate responsibility for the disaster, and he carried that weight with dignity throughout the final hours. There are conflicting accounts of his final moments, but all agree that he remained on the bridge as his ship slipped beneath the waves, going down with the Titanic in accordance with maritime tradition. The ship's musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, became symbols of grace under pressure as they continued to play throughout the evacuation. Their music provided comfort to passengers and crew alike, a reminder of civilization and beauty in the face of catastrophe. The exact song they played as the ship went down has been debated, but their courage in continuing to perform as the deck slanted beneath their feet has never been questioned. As the night wore on and more boats were launched, the ship's increasing list became more pronounced. The forward well deck was now under water, and the ship's bow was settling deeper with each passing minute. The angle of the deck made movement increasingly difficult, and passengers and crew found themselves struggling to maintain their footing on surfaces that had once been level and secure. The later boats carried more passengers as the crew became more desperate to save lives and passengers began to understand the reality of their situation. Women who had initially refused to be separated from their husbands now reluctantly entered the boats. Men who had helped others to safety began to realize that their own chances of survival were dwindling rapidly. Collapsible Boat D, one of the last to be successfully launched, carried 34 people including the Navridal children, whose father had placed them in the boat before disappearing into the crowd on deck. These two young boys, travelling under assumed names, would become known as the Titanic Orphans, when their identity could not be immediately established after the rescue. By 2:05 a.m. all the regular lifeboats had been launched, and only the 4 collapsible boats remained. 2 of these, collapsibles A and B, would be swept off the ship as she foundered, providing precarious refuge for a few additional survivors. The others, C and D, were successfully launched in the final minutes before the ship's end. As the last boats pulled away from the dying ship, those who remained aboard faced the terrible reality that they would go down with the Titanic. The ship's angle was now becoming extreme, and passengers and crew struggled to maintain their footing on the slanting decks. The sounds of the ship, the groan of straining metal, the crash of breaking glass, the roar of water rushing into flood compartments, created a symphony of destruction that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The final moments of the Titanic were both swift and eternal. At approximately 2:17 a.m, the ship's lights flickered and went out as the engine rooms flooded and the generators failed. In the darkness, the great ship shuddered and broke apart between the 3rd and 4th funnels, her stern section rising high into the air before crashing back down onto the water. For a few moments the stern section remained afloat, its lights even flickering back on briefly, before it too slipped beneath the waves. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The ship that had been proclaimed practically unsinkable had survived less than 3 hours after striking the iceberg. In the space of those few hours, the optimism of an entire age had been shattered, and the world had learned that human pride and technological achievement were still subject to the ancient laws of nature and the sea. The silence that followed the ship's disappearance was broken only by the cries of those struggling in the freezing water. The temperature of the North Atlantic in April was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill within minutes. Most of those who went down with the ship died not from drowning, but from hypothermia, their bodies succumbing to the bitter cold before they could be rescued. In the lifeboats, survivors huddled together against the cold, listening to the voices from the water gradually fade into silence. Some boats attempted to return to pick up survivors, but most stayed away, their occupants fearing that desperate swimmers would swamp their already overcrowded boats. This decision, while understandable, meant that many who might have been saved were left to die in the water, while boats that could have accommodated more people drifted nearby. The tragedy of the Titanic was not just in the loss of life, though that was enormous and heartbreaking. It was also in the loss of innocence, the shattering of a worldview that had believed human progress could overcome any obstacle. The ship had been more than a means of transportation. She had been a symbol of human achievement, a floating proof that civilization had mastered the natural world. Her loss marked the end of an age of confidence and the beginning of a more uncertain and humble relationship between humanity and the forces of nature. As dawn approached on April 15th, the survivors in the lifeboats found themselves scattered across several square miles of empty ocean. The night had been clear and calm, but with the sunrise came a bitter wind that made their ordeal even more miserable. Many survivors were inadequately dressed for the cold, having left their warm staterooms in nightclothes or hastily thrown on garments. They huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and comforting each other as best they could while scanning the horizon for signs of rescue. The lifeboats themselves were a study in human nature under extreme stress. Some boats maintained discipline and order, with passengers taking turns at the oars and sharing resources equitably. Others descended into squabbling and a recrimination as exhaustion and shock took their toll on civilized behaviour. In Boat 6, Margaret Molly Brown emerged as a natural leader, organising the rowing and keeping spirits up with her indomitable optimism and forceful personality. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, in charge of Boat 14, displayed remarkable seamanship and courage by redistributing passengers among several boats and then returning to the wreck site to search for survivors. His boat was the only one to make a serious attempt at rescue from the water, and they managed to pull one man from the sea, though he died shortly after being brought aboard. Lowe's actions demonstrated that rescue was possible, making the failure of other boats to attempt it all the more tragic. Collapsible Boat B had been swept off the ship upside down, but about 30 people managed to climb onto its overturned hull. Throughout the night, these men stood balanced on the unstable boat, shifting their weight in unison to prevent it from capsizing completely. Among them were wireless operator Harold Bride and Colonel Archibald Gracie, who had both survived to tell their stories. The men on Boat B faced a particularly precarious situation, as any misstep could plunge them into the fatal waters. As the sun rose higher, the survivors began to display the effects of their ordeal. Many were suffering from exposure, their lips blue and their hands numb from the cold. Some showed signs of shock, staring vacantly at the water or muttering incoherently. Others maintained remarkable composure, organising their boats and encouraging their fellow survivors with displays of courage that would be remembered long after the rescue. The emotional toll of the disaster was as severe as the physical hardships. Wives who had been separated from their husbands scanned the other boats desperately, hoping to catch sight of familiar faces. Children cried for parents who would never be seen again. The social barriers that had seemed so important aboard the ship dissolved in the face of shared tragedy, as first-class passengers found themselves in boats with steerage passengers, all equal in their vulnerability and their dependence on each other for survival. At approximately 4:00 a.m, as the survivors were beginning to despair of rescue, a light appeared on the horizon. The Carpathia, a Cunard liner that had been steaming at full speed toward the Titanic's last known position, finally came into view. Captain Arthur Rostron had pushed his ship beyond her normal capabilities, adding extra stokers to the engine room and taking every possible risk to reach the scene as quickly as possible. The sight of the Carpathia's lights brought tears of relief to many survivors, but it also brought the full reality of their situation into sharp focus. As the rescue ship approached, it became clear that the lifeboats represented all that remained of the Titanic's human cargo. The great ship herself was gone, resting on the ocean floor with more than 1,500 souls still aboard her. The rescue operation began at dawn, with the Carpathia's crew working methodically to bring the survivors aboard. The ship's passengers, awakened by the unusual activity, emerged on deck to witness scenes that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Women and children were lifted aboard in rope slings, many of them in nightclothes and bare feet, their faces marked by exposure and trauma. The crew worked with quiet efficiency, providing medical attention, warm clothing, and hot food to people who had endured unimaginable hardship. As each lifeboat was emptied and its survivors brought aboard, the final tally of the disaster became clear. Of the approximately 224 passengers and crew who had sailed from Southampton, only 710 survived. The loss of life was staggering. More than 100 people had perished in the disaster, making it one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. The survivors' stories began to emerge as they recovered from their immediate ordeal. Tales of heroism and cowardice, of calm acceptance and desperate panic, painted a complex picture of human behaviour under the most extreme circumstances. Some passengers had faced death with remarkable dignity, while others had abandoned all pretense of civilization in their struggle to survive. Captain Rostron ordered the Carpathia to remain in the area for several hours, searching for additional survivors who might have been missed. The ship steamed slowly through the debris field, her crew scanning the water for signs of life. They found only bodies floating in life jackets, grim testimony to the efficiency of the North Atlantic's killing cold. A few personal effects were recovered: deck chairs, life rings, pieces of wood bearing the Titanic's name, but no additional survivors were found. The Carpathia's wireless operator worked steadily to transmit news of the rescue to the outside world, but the messages were fragmentary and often confused. The public, hungry for information about the disaster, received conflicting reports that alternately raised and dashed their hopes. Some early reports suggested that all passengers had been saved, while others painted an accurate but devastating picture of massive loss of life. As the Carpathia turned toward New York with her cargo of survivors, the full magnitude of the disaster began to sink in. The ship that had been proclaimed unsinkable had foundered on her maiden voyage, taking with her some of the most prominent names in American and British society. The passenger list read like a who's who of the era's elite, and their loss sent shockwaves through the highest levels of society on both sides of the Atlantic. But the disaster affected far more than just the wealthy and famous. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving behind only memories and grief. The third-class passengers, many of them immigrants seeking better lives in America, had suffered disproportionately high casualty rates. Their dreams of prosperity and freedom had ended in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, and their stories would largely be overshadowed by the more dramatic tales of the famous passengers. The survivors faced the difficult task of coming to terms with their experience and rebuilding their lives. Many would be forever changed by what they'd witnessed, carrying the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. Some would become advocates for maritime safety, working to ensure that such a disaster could never happen again. Others would prefer to remain silent, unable or unwilling to revisit the memories of that terrible night. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York, her survivors began the long process of healing and remembrance that would continue for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the end of an age of innocence and the beginning of a new era, marked by a more humble recognition of human limitations. The sea had reclaimed its ancient power, and the world would never again view technological progress with quite the same unbounded optimism that had characterized the age of the Titanic. The news of the Titanic disaster spread across the world with the speed of electricity, but the information was fragmentary and often contradictory. In an age before radio broadcasting, when international communication depended on undersea cables and wireless telegraphy, the story emerged in pieces, creating confusion and wild speculation that only added to the public's shock and disbelief. The first reports to reach New York were optimistic, suggesting that while the Titanic had struck an iceberg, all passengers were safe and the ship was being towed to Halifax. These reports, based on incomplete wireless transmissions and hopeful assumptions, filled the front pages of Monday morning newspapers. Families of passengers gathered at the White Star Line offices, expecting to receive confirmation that their loved ones were safe aboard rescue ships. But as Monday, April 15th progressed, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Wireless messages from the Carpathia painted a devastating picture of a massive loss of life. The ship that had been proclaimed practically unsinkable had foundered completely, taking more than half her passengers and crew with her to the bottom of the Atlantic. The news struck the public consciousness like a thunderbolt, shattering the comfortable assumptions of an age that had believed human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. In London, the news reached the offices of Harland and Wolff, the shipyard that had built the Titanic with such pride and care. Workers who had driven the rivets and fitted the plates that formed her hull stood in stunned silence as they learned that their masterpiece lay in pieces on the ocean floor. The ship they had created as a testament to human achievement had become instead a monument to human fallibility. The financial markets reacted swiftly to the news, with shares in the International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line, plummeting as investors grasped the implications of the disaster. The loss of the ship itself was enormous, but the potential legal liabilities from passenger lawsuits threatened to bankrupt the company. Insurance companies faced claims that would reach into the millions of dollars, unprecedented sums for the era. But the financial impact paled beside the human cost of the disaster. Families across America and Europe found themselves shattered by loss, their lives forever changed by the events of that cold April night. The social register of New York and London read like a casualty list, with some of the era's most prominent families mourning the loss of husbands, fathers and sons who had gone down with the ship. The Astor family mourned the loss of Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, one of America's richest men, who had helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat before disappearing into the crowd on the Titanic's deck. His death sent shockwaves through New York society and marked the end of an era for one of America's most prominent families. His widow, Madeleine, survived to give birth to their son, but she would carry the trauma of that night for the rest of her life. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store, had both perished in the disaster, their love story becoming one of its most poignant elements. Witnesses reported that Ida had refused to be separated from her husband, choosing to die beside him rather than take a place in a lifeboat. Their deaths shocked the business community and provided a powerful example of devotion that would be remembered long after the details of the sinking were forgotten. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, had reportedly dressed in evening clothes and prepared to meet his fate like a gentleman. His death, along with that of other prominent businessmen, symbolized the end of an era of American industrial confidence and the beginning of a more uncertain age. But for every famous name on the casualty list, there were dozens of unknown victims whose stories were equally tragic. Third-class passengers who had sold everything they owned to purchase tickets to America died without ever seeing the land of their dreams. Families were separated forever, with wives and children surviving while husbands and fathers perished in the freezing water. The crew's losses were particularly severe, with Captain Smith and most of his senior officers going down with the ship. These men, who had dedicated their lives to the sea, faced their final moments with the dignity and courage that maritime tradition demanded. Their sacrifice helped ensure that as many passengers as possible escaped the sinking ship, even as their own chances of survival diminished with each passing minute. The disaster's impact extended far beyond those directly affected by the loss of life. The sinking of the Titanic challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and safety that had characterized the early 20th century. If a ship as advanced and well-built as the Titanic could be destroyed by a collision with ice, what confidence could the public have in any technological achievement? The tragedy also exposed deep social inequalities that many had preferred to ignore. The disparity in survival rates between first-class and third-class passengers highlighted the extent to which social class determined not just comfort, but survival itself. While 97% of first-class women survived, only 49% of third-class women lived through the disaster. These statistics would fuel social reform movements and contribute to growing demands for greater equality and justice. Religious leaders struggled to find meaning in the disaster, with some interpreting it as divine punishment for human pride and others seeing it as a test of faith. The image of the ship's band playing hymns as the vessel sank became a powerful symbol of spiritual courage in the face of death, inspiring sermons and religious writings that attempted to find redemption in tragedy. The press coverage of the disaster was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Newspapers devoted entire editions to the story, with headlines that captured the public's shock and disbelief. "Titanic sinks 4 hours after hitting iceberg," declared the New York Times, while other papers used even more dramatic language to convey the magnitude of the tragedy. Reporters scrambled to interview survivors, government officials, and maritime experts, creating a cacophony of voices that often conflicted with each other. Heroic tales were embellished, while embarrassing incidents were sometimes covered up or minimized. The story of the disaster became as much about the telling as about the events themselves, with each retelling adding new layers of meaning and interpretation. The public's hunger for information about the disaster seemed insatiable. People gathered around newspaper stands and in telegraph offices, desperate for any scrap of news about the fate of passengers. The lists of survivors were studied like sacred texts, with families and friends searching for familiar names and trying to piece together what had happened to their loved ones. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York with her cargo of survivors, the city prepared for their arrival with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Crowds gathered at the docks, and reporters prepared for the biggest story of their careers. The survivors, many still in shock from their ordeal, would soon find themselves at the center of a media circus that would subject their private grief to public scrutiny. The disaster marked the end of an age of innocence and the beginning of a new era of skepticism about technological progress. The 20th century, which had begun with such optimism and confidence, would now be forever marked by the memory of that cold April night when the sea reclaimed its ancient power over human ambition. As the Carpathia approached New York Harbor on the evening of April 18, 1912, she carried with her not just 705 survivors of the Titanic disaster, but the shattered remnants of an age's confidence in human achievement. The stories that emerged from those who had lived through the tragedy were as varied as the passengers themselves, but each one carried within it a piece of the larger human drama that had played out in the North Atlantic's freezing waters. Among the survivors was Margaret Brown, the wife of a Colorado mining millionaire who had become known to history as the Unsinkable Molly Brown. Her forceful personality and natural leadership had helped maintain morale in Lifeboat 6, and her insistence on returning to search for survivors had been overruled only by the boat's quartermaster. Her story became emblematic of the courage and determination that had helped some passengers survive the unthinkable. Charles Lightoller, the Titanic's second officer, had supervised the loading of lifeboats on the port side of the ship and had been one of the last people to leave the sinking vessel. His survival was almost miraculous. He had been pulled down with the ship as she sank, then blown back to the surface by air escaping from a ventilator. His testimony would prove crucial in the investigations that followed, and his calm professionalism in the face of disaster exemplified the best traditions of the merchant marine. Dorothy Gibson, a young actress who'd been travelling in first class, survived in Lifeboat 7 and would later star in a film about the disaster that was released just 1 month after the sinking. Her movie, Saved from the Titanic, was one of the first attempts to dramatise the tragedy, but the stress of recreating her experiences proved too much for Gibson, and she suffered a nervous breakdown during filming. The Navratil children, Michelle and Edmond, became known as the Titanic orphans when their father perished in the sinking and their identities could not be immediately established. Their father had been travelling under an assumed name after kidnapping the boys from their mother in France. The photograph of these two young survivors, alone and bewildered, became one of the most poignant images of the disaster and helped personalise the tragedy for a grieving public. Eva Hart, who was 7 years old at the time of the disaster, survived with her mother, while her father perished in the sinking. She would carry the memory of that night for the rest of her long life, becoming one of the disaster's most articulate survivors and a tireless advocate for maritime safety. Her recollections, preserved in interviews and writings spanning more than 8 decades, provided invaluable insights into the human experience of the tragedy. The stories of those who did not survive were often pieced together from witness accounts and physical evidence. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was last seen in the smoking room, staring at a painting and apparently lost in thought about his creation's fate. His body was never recovered, but his dedication to helping others escape the ship he had designed became part of the disaster's legend. Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest who was travelling to America to officiate at his brother's wedding, remained on the ship to hear confessions and provide comfort to passengers who faced certain death. Witnesses reported that he continued to pray and offer absolution even as the ship's deck tilted beneath his feet. His sacrifice exemplified the spiritual courage that many displayed in their final moments. The ship's postal workers, John Starr March, Oscar Woody and William Logan Gwynn, died attempting to save the mail in the ship's post office. Their dedication to duty, even in the face of rising water and certain death, represented the professionalism and commitment that characterized many of the Titanic's crew. Their bodies were never recovered, but their story became part of the Postal Service's proud tradition of service regardless of circumstances. The band members, led by Wallace Hartley, became symbols of grace under pressure when they continued to play music as the ship sank. The exact final song they performed has been debated by historians, with some claiming it was the hymn Nearer, My God to Thee, while others argue for Autumn, or Song d'automne. Regardless of the specific piece, their decision to provide comfort through music in their final moments elevated them to mythic status in the disaster's aftermath. Captain Edward Smith's final moments were the subject of numerous conflicting accounts. Some witnesses claimed he swam to a lifeboat and handed up a baby before disappearing beneath the waves. Others reported that he remained on the bridge as the ship went down, going down with his vessel in accordance with maritime tradition. The truth may never be known, but his reputation as the millionaire's captain was forever linked to the tragedy that ended his long career. The disaster created unexpected heroes among passengers who might never have been tested under normal circumstances. Colonel Archibald Gracie, a historian and writer, helped numerous women into lifeboats before finding himself struggling for survival on the overturned collapsible boat B. His detailed account of the disaster, written from his unique perspective as both participant and trained observer, became one of the most valuable first-hand records of the tragedy. Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old first-class passenger, was separated from his parents during the evacuation and ended up in the water as the ship sank. His survival was remarkable. He managed to reach the overturned collapsible boat B and spent the night balanced on its hull with about 30 other men. His youth and athletic ability helped him survive conditions that killed many older and less physically capable passengers. The stories of the lost and saved reveal the arbitrary nature of survival in the disaster. Social class certainly played a role in determining who lived and who died, but luck, physical location at the time of the collision, and random chance were equally important factors. Some first-class passengers perished while some third-class passengers survived, demonstrating that the tragedy, while influenced by social inequality, ultimately transcended class distinctions in its final accounting. The children who survived the disaster carried its memory forward into the 20th and 21st centuries, becoming living links to an event that defined an era. Their recollections, preserved in oral histories and written accounts, provided perspectives on the tragedy that were both innocent and profound, unmarked by the adult concerns about social position and propriety that coloured many other accounts. The disaster also created lasting bonds among survivors, who formed organisations and held regular reunions to commemorate their shared experience. These gatherings served both as memorials to those who perished and as mutual support networks for people who had lived through trauma that few others could understand. The survivors' stories, told and retold at these gatherings, helped preserve the human dimension of the tragedy against the tendency of time to reduce it to statistics and technical analysis. The legacy of individual stories from the Titanic disaster extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. These personal accounts became part of the cultural memory of the 20th century, influencing literature, film, and popular culture for generations. They reminded the world that behind every historical event are individual human beings, each with their own hopes, fears, and dreams, each deserving of remembrance and respect. The stories of the Titanic's passengers and crew continue to resonate more than a century after the disaster, because they speak to universal human experiences: love, loss, courage, fear, sacrifice, and survival. In their individual tragedies and triumphs, we see reflections of our own mortality and our own capacity for both heroism and frailty in the face of circumstances beyond our control. For 73 years, the RMS Titanic lay undisturbed on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The ship that had been the marvel of her age rested in eternal darkness, slowly succumbing to the corrosive power of salt water and the relentless pressure of the deep. She had become legend and myth, her physical reality reduced to memories and artifacts pulled from the lifeboats by survivors who had escaped her final plunge. The technology to explore such depths did not exist in 1912 or for many decades afterward. The Titanic lay far deeper than any submarine could descend, far beyond the reach of any salvage equipment. She existed in a realm as remote as the surface of the moon, her secrets locked away in the crushing darkness of the abyssal plain. Occasionally scientists and adventurers would speculate about finding her, but the technical challenges seemed insurmountable. During World War II, sonar technology advanced dramatically, but even the most sophisticated equipment of the era could not penetrate to the depths where the Titanic rested. The ship remained lost, her exact position known only approximately from the coordinates transmitted by her wireless operators in those final frantic minutes before she sank. The North Atlantic had reclaimed her completely, and it seemed that she would remain forever beyond human reach. In the 1960s and 1970s, deep-sea exploration technology began to advance rapidly. The development of manned submersibles capable of reaching extreme depths opened new possibilities for ocean exploration, but the Titanic remained elusive. Several expeditions attempted to locate the wreck, but the vastness of the search area and the limitations of the equipment available made success unlikely. Just Robert Ballard, a marine geologist and oceanographer, had long dreamed of finding the Titanic. His work with deep-sea exploration vehicles had given him insights into the challenges of locating and documenting shipwrecks in the deep ocean. By the early 80s, he had developed the technology and expertise necessary to mount a serious search for the lost liner. But funding for such an expedition was difficult to secure. The breakthrough came when Ballard arranged a deal with the US Navy to use their deep-sea exploration technology. Officially, his mission was to examine the wrecks of two nuclear submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, but any remaining time could be used to search for the Titanic. This arrangement provided Ballard with access to the sophisticated equipment he needed while serving national security interests. On September 3rd, 1985 at 1:05 a.m., Ballard's team made the discovery that captivated the world. The remotely operated vehicle Argo, working at a depth of 2,500 feet, transmitted images that made hearts skip a beat. The circular outline of a ship's boiler covered in marine growth but unmistakably man-made. After 73 years, the Titanic had been found. The images that followed the initial discovery were both magnificent and haunting. The ship had broken apart as she sank, her bow section landing upright on the ocean floor while her stern section came to rest nearly half a mile away. The bow, though damaged, retained much of its recognizable shape. The forecastle, where third-class passengers had once gathered for fresh air and conversation, was clearly visible, now decorated with icicle-like formations of rust called rusticles. The ship's superstructure told the story of her violent end. The bridge where Captain Smith had spent his final moments was collapsed but still identifiable. The davits that had held the lifeboat stood empty, their burden long since departed for the surface, carrying the precious cargo of human lives. The grand staircase, once the ship's crown jewel, had been reduced to a gaping hole where the ornate dome had collapsed. But it was the personal artifacts scattered around the wreck site that most powerfully connected the present to that tragic night in 1912. Shoes, arranged in pairs on the ocean floor, marked the spots where bodies had once lain before decomposing in the deep ocean's chemistry. Suitcases, their leather preserved by the cold water, lay open with their contents spilled across the sediment. A child's doll stared sightlessly into the eternal darkness, a mute testimony to innocence lost. The debris field between the bow and stern sections revealed the chaos of the ship's final moments. Pieces of the hull, sections of decking, furniture, and personal belongings that were scattered across nearly a square mile of ocean floor. Each artifact told part of the story of that night. A bathtub from a first-class stateroom, a safe from the purser's office, bottles of wine still corked and labelled, their contents preserved by the deep sea's constant cold. The discovery of the Titanic sparked intense public interest and scientific debate. For the first time since 1912, people could see the ship that had become synonymous with human hubris and tragedy. The images transmitted from the ocean floor had an immediate emotional impact, bringing the disaster into sharp focus for a generation that had known it only through books and survivors' accounts. Ballard's team spent several days documenting the wreck, using both manned submersibles and remotely operated vehicles to explore and photograph the debris field. The scientific value of their work was enormous, providing insights not only into the Titanic herself, but into the process of deep ocean preservation and decay. The wreck had become an artificial reef, supporting unique ecosystems adapted to the extreme conditions of the deep sea. The stern section of the ship told a different story from the bow. Where the forward portion had landed relatively intact, the stern had been devastated by the violent forces of the sinking. The hull plates were peeled back like the petals of a flower, revealing the ship's internal structure. The damage was so severe that the stern section was barely recognizable as part of a ship, appearing more like a twisted mass of metal than a piece of the world's most famous ocean liner. The discovery raised immediate questions about the ethics of exploring and potentially salvaging the wreck. To many, the Titanic was not just a shipwreck but a gravesite, the final resting place of more than 1,500 people. The idea of disturbing the wreck or removing artifacts seemed tantamount to grave robbing, a desecration of the memory of those who had died. Ballard himself was a strong advocate for leaving the wreck undisturbed, viewing it as a monument that should be preserved in its natural state. He compared the Titanic to the Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, arguing that both were sacred sites that should be respected rather than exploited. His position sparked a debate about maritime archaeology, cultural heritage, and the proper treatment of disaster sites that continues to this day. The condition of the wreck was both better and worse than experts had expected. The cold, oxygen-poor water of the deep North Atlantic had helped preserve organic materials like leather and wood, but the ship's steel structure was being consumed by bacteria that fed on iron. The rusticles that covered much of the wreck were not just rust but living organisms, slowly devouring the ship from the outside in. Scientists estimated that the Titanic was deteriorating at an accelerating rate. The ship that had survived 73 years on the ocean floor might not survive another century in recognizable form. This realization added urgency to efforts to document the wreck thoroughly before it was lost forever to the forces of decay and time. The images of the Titanic on the ocean floor created a powerful visual connection to the disaster that no written account could match. Seeing the ship's wheel, still mounted on its pedestal but surrounded by twisted metal and marine growth, brought home the reality of the tragedy in ways that statistics and survivor stories could not. The wreck made the disaster tangible and immediate, transforming it from historical artifact to present reality. The discovery also revealed new details about the ship's construction and the circumstances of her sinking. The condition of the hull plates and the pattern of damage provided insights into the collision with the iceberg and the forces that had torn the ship apart. Engineers and naval architects could study the wreck to better understand both the disaster itself and the principles of ship design and construction. The Titanic's rediscovery marked the beginning of a new chapter in her story, one that would involve legal battles over salvage rights, ethical debates about the proper treatment of disaster sites, and continued scientific study of one of history's most famous shipwrecks. The ship that had been lost to human memory was found again, but her rediscovery raised as many questions as it answered about humanity's relationship with its own tragic history. The legacy of the Titanic extends far beyond the events of that cold April night in 1912. In the centuries since her sinking, the ship has become more than a historical tragedy. She has evolved into a powerful symbol that speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, technological progress, and the relationship between civilization and the natural world. The immediate aftermath of the disaster brought significant changes to maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, first adopted in 1914 and updated regularly since, established mandatory safety standards that were directly inspired by the lessons learned from the Titanic tragedy. Ships were required to carry sufficient lifeboats for all passengers and crew, maintain continuous radio watches, and conduct regular safety drills. The establishment of the International Ice Patrol in 1914 represented another direct response to the disaster. This organisation, initially funded by 13 nations whose ships used the North Atlantic shipping lanes, was tasked with monitoring ice conditions and warning vessels of dangerous icebergs. The patrol's work has been so effective that no lives have been lost to iceberg collisions in the patrolled area since the Titanic disaster, but the Titanic's influence extended far beyond technical maritime reforms. The disaster became a cultural touchstone, inspiring countless books, films, songs, and works of art that have kept her memory alive for successive generations. Each retelling of the story has reflected the values and concerns of its own era, making the Titanic a mirror, in which different generations have seen reflections of their own fears and aspirations. In the decades immediately following the disaster, the Titanic story was often told as a moral tale about the dangers of human pride and the importance of humility before the forces of nature. The ship's claim to being practically unsinkable was seen as an example of the hubris that preceded the fall, and the disaster was interpreted as a divine judgment on an age that had become too confident in its own abilities. The class distinctions that had characterized the ship's passengers became symbols of broader social inequalities, and the disaster was used to argue for social reforms and greater equality. The fact that a higher percentage of first-class passengers survived than those in steerage was cited as evidence of a society that valued some lives more than others, and the tragedy became part of the broader movement for social justice. During the Great Depression and World War II, the Titanic story took on new meanings as a symbol of how quickly prosperity and security could be lost. The image of the unsinkable ship lying broken on the ocean floor resonated with people who had seen their own seemingly secure worlds collapse around them. The disaster became a reminder of the fragility of human achievements and the importance of preparing for unexpected catastrophes. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 sparked a new wave of interest in the Titanic story, this time focused on the ship herself, rather than just the human drama of the disaster. The haunting images from the ocean floor gave the story a visual dimension that captured public imagination and inspired a new generation of books, documentaries, and eventually the blockbuster film that would make the Titanic story known to audiences worldwide. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic brought the story to a global audience in a way that no previous telling had achieved. By combining a fictional love story with historically accurate details of the disaster, the film made the tragedy accessible to viewers who might not have been interested in a purely historical account. The movie's success demonstrated the enduring power of the Titanic story to move and inspire audiences more than 8 decades after the actual event. The film also sparked new debates about the proper way to remember and commemorate historical tragedies. Some critics argued that the fictional love story trivialized the real suffering of the disaster's victims, while others contended that the emotional engagement created by the fictional elements helped viewers connect more deeply with the historical reality. This debate reflected broader questions about how popular culture should handle tragic historical events. Museums and memorials around the world have preserved artifacts from the ship and the stories of her passengers and crew. The Titanic Belfast Museum, built in the city where the ship was constructed, tells the story of her creation and loss, with a focus on the skilled workers who built her and the community that sent her to sea. The Titanic museums in Branson, Missouri and Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, use interactive exhibits to help visitors understand the human experience of the disaster. The wreck itself has become a pilgrimage site for some, with expensive tourist expeditions offering civilians the chance to descend to the ocean floor and see the ship with their own eyes. These visits raise complex ethical questions about the commercialization of a disaster site, but they also provide a powerful personal encounter with history that few other experiences can match. Scientific study of the wreck continues to yield new insights into both the disaster itself and the broader questions of deep ocean preservation and maritime archaeology. Researchers have used the Titanic as a laboratory for studying how ships deteriorate in deep water, and their findings have implications for the preservation of countless other shipwrecks around the world. The legal battles over salvage rights to the Titanic have established important precedents for the treatment of historic shipwrecks. Courts have had to balance the interests of salvage companies, which argue that their expensive recovery operations deserve compensation, against the concerns of families, governments, and preservationists who believe that disaster sites should remain undisturbed. The Titanic story has also become intertwined with broader questions about risk, safety, and the unintended consequences of technological progress. In an age of climate change, nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, the story of a ship destroyed by overconfidence in technology resonates with contemporary concerns about humanity's ability to manage the powerful forces it has unleashed. Environmental organizations have used the Titanic as a symbol of humanity's relationship with the natural world, pointing out that the disaster occurred when human technology encountered natural forces that had not been adequately considered or respected. The iceberg that sank the ship had been formed thousands of years before humans learned to build ships, yet its encounter with the most advanced vessel of its time proved that nature's power remained supreme. The story continues to evolve as new generations discover it and find in it reflections of their own concerns and experiences. For some, it remains primarily a story of human tragedy and loss. For others, it is a tale of heroism and sacrifice under extreme circumstances. Still others see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of technological hubris and social inequality. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Titanic's legacy is its reminder of human mortality and the unpredictability of fate. The disaster demonstrated that no achievement, however impressive, can guarantee safety from the unexpected. The passengers who boarded the ship in Southampton could not have imagined that their voyage would end in tragedy, just as we cannot predict what unforeseen circumstances might affect our own lives. The Titanic serves as a memorial not just to those who died in the disaster, but to all the dreams and aspirations that were lost when the ship went down. She carries with her the memory of an age that believed firmly in progress and human achievement, and her loss marked the end of that innocent confidence. In remembering the Titanic, we remember not just a ship and her passengers, but an entire worldview that died with her in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Yet the story also carries messages of hope and resilience. The courage displayed by passengers and crew in the face of certain death, the heroism of those who sacrificed their own chances of survival to help others, and the strength of the survivors who rebuilt their lives after tragedy all speak to the enduring power of the human spirit. The Titanic may have been destroyed by her encounter with ice and sea, but the values and virtues displayed during her final hours continue to inspire more than a century later. And with that, dear listener, we reach the end of tonight's journey. May it bring you peace, calm, and gentle dreams.